Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are following up on our initial RTX 3080 reviews with a look at another AIB card. This time it is one from ASUS. Specifically we are looking at the RTX 3080 TUF Gaming OC. This is actually the second AIB card we have looked at that comes priced at MSRP, or at least that is going to be the case once it comes back into stock. Still, usually MSRP cards of the past have had not so good cooling and they don't really have that many features. But the TUF Gaming has an impressive all-metal shroud, it's got a triple fan cooler, it comes factory overclocked, and there's even onboard dual BIOS support. So, is this the best RTX 3080 we have reviewed so far? If we start things off with a look at the design, it is immediately impressive to see that ASUS has used an all-aluminium shroud for the TUF Gaming. This isn't something we typically see, and certainly not on cards that actually come in at the MSRP. It really helps give the card a solid and premium feel in the hand, and it really just does make a much better first impression than a plastic shroud. The fact that it is very colour neutral as well, being very dark grey, almost black but not quite I don't think, that only helps its appeal, as you'd have no issues installing this in a colour matched build. Like the other third party RTX 3080s we have reviewed, it is certainly not a small card, and it actually measures in at 299.9 by 126.9 by 51.7mm. So that means it is technically a 2.7 slot card, but really is a 3 slot card, and as always we do recommend to make sure that this will actually fit in your case. Speaking of size, we can also note that those 3 fans all measure 90mm across, and these are ASUS's Axial Tech design. This has actually been updated since the previous generation, and the company claims that these fans should now deliver increased airflow at slightly lower noise levels. We can also see that ASUS has taken a leaf out of Gigabyte's book, and that is when we're talking about the central fan, as it now actually spins in reverse relative to the outer two. This should just reduce airflow turbulence. Elsewhere, we can see that ASUS has gone for a full-length metal backplate. It's again brushed aluminium, which looks really good. It's got the TUF Gaming and GeForce RTX logos, and we can also see a couple of cutouts to the backplate itself to allow air to pass directly through the heatsink. ASUS is also keen to point out that it has now added a GPU mounting bracket for the TUF Gaming cooler. This is that small bracket you can see on the back of the PCB, and it should just increase overall mounting pressure between the GPU die itself and the cooler. I think ASUS is really trying to show that it is improved from its previous generation, as you know, there were a number of comments about the insufficient mounting pressure of some of its last gen designs, so it's good to see the company taking steps. Another good feature I like to see is that dual BIOS switch as well. By default, the card comes using the performance BIOS, but you can switch this over to the quiet BIOS, and we will be testing both of these later on in the review. As for the display outputs as well, we have a total of 5, and that's 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, and then 3 DisplayPort 1.4a ports. In terms of power as well, it's a standard 2 8-pin power connectors for the TUF Gaming. Now we will move on to talk about the PCB, and actually the first thing you really notice here is that secondary heatsink used to cool the VRAM. Again, I really think this is ASUS listening to the feedback it got on some of its last gen cards, as some of the memory cooling on its TUF 5700 and 5700 XT cards was quite bad, to put it mildly. So really good to see them taking steps here. Unfortunately, the thermal pads ASUS used I found to be very delicate, so I couldn't actually remove this heatsink without just breaking them completely, and that's not something I wanted to do, as this was a review sample ASUS shipped to me that does need to be sent back. What this means is I can't show you the bare PCB, but we can still make out the 20-stage power delivery. This is configured with 16 phases for the GPU and 4 for the memory, using Vishay's 55A SIC641A power stages. Memory is of course provided by 10 modules of Micron's GDDR6, clocked at 19 gigabits per second. As for the heatsink, this uses 2 separate fin stacks, which are connected by a total of 6 6mm nickel-plated copper heat pipes. The GPU itself contacts with a nickel-plated copper base plate, and we can see an additional plate for the VRM. As we showed earlier as well, of course, the memory is cooled by that secondary heatsink. So then that is really it for our look at the card, the PCB and the cooler, and we'll now move on to talk about how it performs. For this, we used our standard GPU test rig provided by PC Specialist, built around an overclocked Intel i9-10900K running at 5.1 GHz on all cores. This is paired with the ASUS ROG Maximus 12 Hero motherboard and 32GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR4 running at 3600 MHz. For all of our game testing, we used the default performance BIOS, but for things like noise and temperatures, we did test both the performance and the quiet BIOS options. Starting with the thermal performance then, we can immediately see ASUS has done a great job with this cooler. Using the performance BIOS, the GPU did not exceed 62 degrees during our testing, and that's actually a reduction of 14 degrees compared to Nvidia's Founders Edition. Even the quiet BIOS, which has a more relaxed fan profile, only hit 69 degrees, which is still 7 degrees cooler than the Founders card. It's really good to see such impressive temperatures here, and the fact is those results look even better after seeing just how loud this card is. That's because even when using the performance BIOS, the TUF Gaming is no louder than the Founders Edition despite running 14 degrees cooler. There we can see the performance BIOS spinning the fans at 75% or about 1930 RPM, but the quiet BIOS does drop this down to 64% or 1470 RPM. That makes a noticeable difference to noise levels, as now the TUF is only marginally louder than the MSI Gaming X Trio. It really is an impressive all-round cooler, which I think strikes an excellent balance between temperatures and noise levels. Moving on to power draw, here both BIOS modes pulled pretty much the same in terms of total system power draw, which was right around the 470 watt mark in our testing. That is really because both BIOS have the same 340 watt power target, which is demonstrated when looking at the GPU only power draw as reported by GPU-Z. Here, both BIOS averaged 338 watts for the duration of our stress test. So, while there may be no difference in terms of power, we can see the quiet BIOS does run marginally slower, but only due to the fact it runs a little warmer as a result of its more relaxed fan curve. The performance BIOS averaged just under 1900 MHz in terms of its average clock speed, which compares to 1875 MHz for the quiet BIOS. That's only a 25 MHz difference, so the choice of BIOS doesn't really make that much difference in terms of overall clock speeds. As for our game benchmarks now, in this video we're going to be focusing on the 4K performance in a number of titles, but that's really only because we already know how fast 3080 is and we're just trying to see how much faster the TUF Gaming is compared to the Founders Edition. If you want to see all of our benchmarks, including both 1080p and 1440p data, then do head over to the written article on kitguru.net. Starting with control, here the TUF Gaming averaged 52 frames per second, and that is actually the exact same result as Nvidia's Founders Edition. So at least in this game, there isn't really any benefit to the TUF's increased speed. In the Division 2, however, we do see a small performance uplift, as the TUF averaged 78 FPS. This is 2 frames faster than the Founders Edition, which works out as a 3% bump in performance. Meanwhile, we can also see small gains when testing with Metro Exodus. Another increase of 2 frames per second is a 2% performance gain versus the Founders Edition, which puts the TUF marginally behind the Gigabyte Eagle RTX 3080. Shadow of the Tomb Raider follows a pretty similar trend to these games, where we can see the TUF Gaming comes in 2 FPS faster than Nvidia's Founders Edition. At 4K, this works out as an improvement of 3%. Lastly, Total War Saga Troy is pretty insensitive to clock speed, and here we can see that the TUF Gaming, Gigabyte Eagle and Nvidia's Founders Edition all deliver identical performance at 4K, averaging 58 frames per second. In a nutshell then, it's safe to say that the TUF Gaming's extra clock speed doesn't really bring it much in terms of overall performance gains, and in actual fact, averaged across all of our testing at 4K, this card is just 1% faster than Nvidia's Founders Edition. That does mean that Gigabyte's RTX 3080 Eagle is technically the faster card on paper, but in reality it simply makes no difference as the margins are so small. We're only talking a difference of 1 to 2 frames per second, which is so small you're simply not going to notice. Of course, we did try and improve on these results though by manual overclocking, and here the TUF Gaming actually did slightly better than some of the other cards we have already tested. We could add an extra 70 MHz to the GPU core, while the memory was able to add an offset of 900 MHz, which brings total GDDR6X speeds to 20.8 gigabits per second. This resulted in gains of up to 4% based on our 4K testing, so we're not really talking big gains compared to stock. However, that does seem to be a limitation of Nvidia's GA102 GPU, rather than a limitation of the TUF Gaming itself. Wrapping up this review then, I think it is very clear ASUS has done an absolutely fantastic job with its TUF Gaming RTX 3080. In fact, I think if it weren't for the shroud design, this card simply could have been called the ROG Strix and nobody would have batted an eye. It really is that good. Considering it comes in at MSRP as well, it really is a bit of a no-brainer. It has excellent thermal performance, its noise levels are good and especially so when using the quiet BIOS, and the fact that it even has dual BIOS puts it above many of the other cards that will come in at MSRP. So overall, it is really a very easy recommendation to make. The TUF Gaming is an excellent card, and if you're looking for an RTX 3080, or at least when they come back into stock, I have to say this would be a very good buy. I also have to say it's really encouraging to see ASUS has clearly listened to the feedback that it got for some of its previous generation designs. Some of those TUF and Strix coolers definitely did have some issues, but they seem to have completely fixed that with this new TUF Gaming. So again, that is really good to see that they've taken this feedback on board. That is going to do it for this review though, guys, so if you enjoyed it, do toss me a thumbs up. Let me know your thoughts on this TUF Gaming as well. Is it a card you're looking to buy? Perhaps you already tried to buy one? Do let me know your thoughts. While you're there, why not check out a link to our Discord and our merch store over in the description. And finally, it would be awesome if you guys would consider backing us on Patreon, where you can see some of our content early, as well as get access to some exclusive giveaways. Until then though guys, I've been Dominic for Kit Guru, and I will see you in the next video.